there and welcome to my channel, and today I just wanted to talk to you about different methods you can use when using epoxy resin as a coating layer for another material or substance or project. For example, making something out of air dry clay. So I started working with air dry clay as a hobby around a year or so ago. I thought I would include some photographs of finished air dry clay pieces here. I really like the result you can obtain with air dry clay, which is accessible as it is cheap and doesn't require the use of a kiln. As a medium, it also offers a slow-paced way of working, which can be a plus or minus depending on your perspective. For me personally, it's a plus when using this medium, as I like the ease of being able to complete pieces over the course of a few days to a week. Once individual pieces of raw air dry clay have been rolled out, cut and shaped, they generally take 3 days to air dry if left at room temperature. The pieces can then be painted with acrylics or water paints depending on the effect you would like to achieve. The pieces then need to be allowed to dry again for a day or two before a layer of sealant such as Mod Podge or craft glue is applied. The finished dried pieces are generally quite durable after this point. However, one major drawback for air dry clay is there isn't water resistance once it is dried. This effectively means that if the finished clay piece comes into contact with water at any point after completion, it will become malleable once again, which can damage the details of a piece. So whereas sealants like Mod Podge offer some degree of protection for accidental water spills or splashes, the finished air dry clay pieces generally can't be cleaned with water or left outside. I don't find this is a drawback for ornamental pieces that are intended for use around the house, as it is easy to avoid accidental water contact. However, when producing items like jewellery or other household objects that are likely to encounter water, a plant or a soap dish for example, this can be a serious drawback. As such, I started investigating ways to make air dry clay more water resistant. Eventually, I found that epoxy resin can be used as a sealant for air dry clay. Theoretically, this would make this air dry clay piece completely waterproof. So here are some air dry clay badges I've already applied epoxy resin to for reference. I made the badges from air dry clay, painted them, then applied the epoxy to create a glossy top layer. I've obtained some quite good results using epoxy as a sealant, but in practice I've also encountered some issues with the application process. Epoxy resin has syrupy consistency when it is in the liquid state and consequently doesn't remain in place if it is deposited on a surface. The syrup-like consistency is why epoxy is generally used with silicone molds. The epoxy hardens over a 24-hour period but generally remains quite runny for the first hour or so after it has been mixed up. This effectively means that if you place a blob of the epoxy onto the air dry clay to effectively create a glossy top layer of epoxy, it tends to run down the sides of the clay piece. This can mean that as the resin dries, the bottom of the clay piece dries with a sort of hardened drips or pools of resin stuck to it, so not an ideal result there. So after a period of trial and error, I came up with a new method of applying the epoxy to the clay, which is what I'm going to demonstrate for you today. This method I'm demonstrating effectively involves making a makeshift silicone mold out of earplugs. Yes, I know this sounds quite wacky and quite complicated, but hear me out. You can buy various brands of silicone earplugs on Amazon, such as for example the Epoxy silicone earplugs for sleeping. However, any silicone earplug brand will work. Once you have them prepared, you can start by warming the individual earplugs up by rolling them out into your hands, making the silicone malleable. Once the few individual plugs have been rolled out and warmed up in your hands, you can combine them into effectively a bigger blob of silicone. So when this process is complete, you essentially have your mold prepared and can then press the clay piece into the blob of silicone. make sure you press the piece firmly into the silicone. I would like to add that I've only tried this technique out with smaller clay pieces. However, I think it will work with bigger clay pieces providing you add enough silicone earplugs. It could potentially get quite expensive to buy a few packets. So this method will only work if you would like to apply epoxy to one side of the piece at a time. To apply the epoxy to the other side of the piece, you will need to wait for one side to dry before flipping the piece around and applying the epoxy to the other side of the piece. So here I am applying epoxy to a leaf badge I made from air-dry clay and subsequently painted. As you can see, I've already applied the epoxy. So here I am applying epoxy to a leaf badge I made from air-dry clay and subsequently painted. As you can see, I've already applied epoxy to the front side of the badge, and today I will be applying another layer of epoxy to the back of the badge as well as attaching the pin. So here you can see me applying the epoxy carefully in drips with the silicone spatula to the badge. Try not to apply so much epoxy that it overflows the mould. As you can see here, some excess epoxy spilled over the side of the mould. However, this can be easily cleaned up by scraping it away with a silicone spatula. Because the silicone mould is in place, the epoxy will not leak onto the underside of the clay piece, which is much more difficult to clean up. So after 24 hours have passed, I have demoulded the piece and here is the final result. And you can actually touch up the sides of the piece with clear nail varnish after the epoxy is fully dried, if desired. So I hope you like these results and I hope you found this video helpful. See you again.